Hello guys, and welcome to another edition of World History Online with Bueno. So this time we're going to talk about Chapter 14, Europe and Western Asia in the Middle Ages. This is from 1800 to 1450, and guess what? We get to fight some crusades. It's kind of morbid sounding, right? Like, yay, we're excited about battles, but the crusades are fun to study about, not to actually live through. But in this chapter, it starts off talking about political developments, and then the Christian church, the crusades, the life of the people, learning and culture, crisis of the later Middle Ages is what it ends on. So we kind of end on a downer, like Black Death, 100 Years' War, peasant and urban revolts. So yeah, let's get started. Here we go. All right, political developments. Let's talk about some invasions and migrations, right? Kind of sounds familiar, kind of a common theme in this course, invasions and migrations. But Europe was under the threat of Northmen. Those are pagan Germanic peoples from territories located in northwestern Europe. The Northmen, or sometimes called Norsemen, they were known as the Vikings. And that was taken from the word Vik, meaning creek. And the Vikings used the waterways inland to attack Central European populations. And these Vikings would attack and grab the riches from the conquered populations and return home with the loot. Later, the Vikings began to settle and intermarry with the people whom they conquered. The Magyars, they were from the Central Steppe, and they were also going to raid European villages to take their wealth and force the conqueror to pay taxes and tributes. We also have North African Muslims. At this time, they had conquered Sicily, and they have established a foothold in Spain. All of these attacks and threats, that leads to a destabilization in Europe, and especially a destabilized European government. For the French, Italians, and English, these threats were terrifying and caused chaos. You have to think, you're a village, you're just minding your own business, and all of a sudden you have the Vikings show up. Kill most of your men, rape most of the women, take maybe some of the kids, and then that's kind of terrifying. And the government doesn't really know how to react to this. And you also don't have, military might not be in your hometown in this village where this is happening. So you really don't have a lot of protection, especially if you live on the fringes of society or close to these frontier areas. So in sort of kind of like a response to that, we have the development of feudalism and serfdom. And this is the relationship between nobles and warriors created the vassal system. So the knight was sworn to loyalty to the lord. So you have your lord of the land, and then underneath him you have these knights that swear their loyalty and will fight for him. The lord gave vassals sections of land called fiefs in exchange for the loyalty oath. This system, it's known as feudalism. We see feudalism being practiced throughout most of the world. Not most, but we're going to see this in Asia. We're going to see it in Europe. We see a little bit of it in Africa. We even have this in the Americas. We don't really call it feudalism, but in essence, we do see this kind of all over the place. The system of feudalism had the warrior class owning the estate and peasants working for them. Often farmers would give their labor to the lord in exchange for protection. They were given land, which they were tied to by various payments and services, and this turned a peasant into a serf. Over half of Western Europe's population became serfs. So kind of going back a little bit, this map is kind of out of order, isn't it? But you can see the Vikings here in the purple. Greenland to North America, if you'll remember, maybe from your American history course, the Vikings settled in the Americas about 500 years before Columbus just rediscovered the Americas. Before the first, before the Spanish and the Portuguese, the French, the English settled, we actually have Vikings that were settling in the Americas. You can see other groups as well and where they're coming from. The other groups that we talked about, the Muslims. So we'll keep moving on. Okay, the restoration of order. So we do see invasions gradually declining, and that really allows estates to grow in size, making the lord a king. Duke William of Normandy defeated the English at the Battle of Hastings, and he is going to become known as William the Conqueror. He distributed the land to his Norman followers. William evaluated the wealth of England by conducting a survey. He sent men throughout the kingdom and recorded the findings in what became known as the Domesday Book. William the Conqueror's great-grandson, Henry II of England, inherited provinces in France from his father. His father was Geoffrey, and Henry married a woman named Eleanor and claimed control over southwestern France, bringing in her claims also. Under King Otto I of Germany, a confederation of states was organized that stretched from the North Sea to the Mediterranean, and it was called the Holy Roman Empire. Frederick Barbarossa tried to unite the Holy Roman Empire, but couldn't gain control over the northern cities of Italy. So here we have Norman territory. This is William the Conqueror coming in, the Battle of Hastings, and kind of claiming this part of France around Normandy. You'll recall from American history the beaches of Normandy, right? And claiming all of this territory in 1066. Under Louis IX of France, each province was allowed to continue its own laws and procedures. So kind of talking about law and justice passed down. But a royal justice system was established that worked as a supreme court over the lower courts. Don't get too bogged down in that. England developed a common law accepted by the whole country. And Prince John, he took the throne of England, and what he does is he begins to establish a very burdensome tax in order to pay state debt. Prince John also lost the provinces in Normandy to Philip Augustus. And English barons are going to end up revolting, and they created the Great Charter, which is known as the Magna Carta, which that becomes the foundation for English law. So go back and read through this section. All these things will start to make sense. You can kind of put it in order better once you read through it. But let's talk about some reforms within the church. So the early church had its clergy and officials chosen by the king. Church offices were often sold, right? So the more money you have, the higher up in the church you could go. Many of the priests who were appointed by the king were already married, ignoring the church's call for celibacy. A series of popes believed secular control of the church was responsible for the lack of morals in church leadership. When you talk about secular control, you're talking about just like the civilian, the regular population outside of the church. The Lateran Council, they declared the cardinals would be the only voice in the election of future popes, not leave it up to the king's favorite being chosen. But we're actually going to let the church control the appointment of popes. Pope Gregory VII ordered all priests to give up their wives and children or be dismissed from clerical duties. Church officials who purchased their positions were invalidated, and nuns were placed under strict control. Rulers protested the church's actions because it hindered their power and control over the church. So again, here we have kings protesting this because they no longer control the church. The church is starting to control itself. Okay, more things happening within the church. Let's talk about monasteries. Talked a little bit about them in the last chapter. We're going to talk more about them obviously here. So monasteries, they provided education and chance for career in the church. Most men were from families with high community standings. So what we see men going to the monastery, usually these are like maybe from rich families, but they could be like the second, third, or fourth son. They know that they're not going to inherit their father's property. And so they turn to a life within the church. We're also, if you study anything about these rich families too, a lot of times these second, third, and fourth sons, some of them will go into the military as well. So they do come from very good families, high community standings, and for some monasteries, economic prosperity eroded the focus of spirituality and led to a decline in the dedication to the church's work. So we see some corruption going on. As the cities began to increase in size, the threat of heresy, a belief that was counter to church doctrine, that's also going to increase. A special court was established to find and prosecute heretics. Probably really familiar with, or at least you've heard of the Spanish Inquisition. It's going to happen too. Popular religion, though. The church was the center for community life. Mass broke the monotonous routine of work. Festivals and other church celebrations and services were held in the church courtyard. The church calendar included special days that recognized saints and their service to God, and each church was typically named after a saint and included a relic from that individual saint. So maybe a clipping of their hair, or one of the robes that they used to wear, or even like fingernail clippings, or it could be a whole hand. That could be a relic. Jewish communities also existed in Europe, along with a smaller number of Muslims. So I don't want you to think like this is just all Christian. No, you do have some like minority religions in Europe during this time as well. They're just not as large as the Christian and as like the Catholic Church. So we are going to see expansion happening. Christianity expanded into Scandinavia, organizing the land and population into dioceses, which were districts, remember, led by a bishop. Dioceses were established in Sweden to stem the spread of pagan cults, and in Eastern European regions, Otto I established dioceses to help conquer the Slavs. In the 9th century, the Byzantine emperor sent missionaries, Cyril and Methodius, to convert the Slavs, and they developed an alphabet based on the Greek alphabet in order to translate scripture into the local language there. The Cyrillic alphabet, it's the one that they came up with. It's named after, obviously, Cyril. It starts to spread, to other Slavic cultures, converting to the Eastern form of Christianity, including the region of Kiev. Vladimir I of Kiev, he converted this early Russian state to Byzantine Christianity, and that's going to further tie these two communities together and this power and culture together. Spanish Christians found the Muslim lands were arguing and divided, and that made it easier to establish control over these regions. Muslims were expelled in the Reconquista, a push to reestablish Christian Spanish rulers. England took over Ireland and barred local people from access to courts and monasteries. So, date of Christian reconquest during the Spanish reconquest, taking parts of Spain back. So you can see here Leon, Aragon, you're probably really familiar with that. Henry VIII's wife is from there, his first wife. But you can kind of see slowly trying to take back this area. Islamic expansion, that threatened Christian lands in the East, and the Pope and church officials supported a war in defense of Christianity. We've got some Turks are going to control Palestine and much of Asia Minor, making religious pilgrimages difficult for Christians. And the Byzantines appealed to the Western powers for help, leading Pope Urban II to call for a crusade against the Muslim control of the Holy Land. The first crusades were successful. And the city of Jerusalem, they were successful for the Christians. Let me get this straight here. And Jerusalem was returned to Christian rule. 4 small crusader states were established. You've got, and we're going to look at a map in just a second. I think they're on there. But Tripoli, Antioch, Jerusalem, those are some of those states. A century later, the Muslims organized under Saladin and retook Jerusalem. However, the crusader states remained very strong. Crusaders were not welcome in the city of Constantinople, so they raided and looted the city, taking many relics back to Europe. During the late 1200s, the Muslims turned toward the crusader states and eventually conquered them. Here we go. You can see here the first crusades, where they're going and who's leading them. Godfrey and Geoffrey. The second crusade is here in red. The third crusade is in dark blue. The fourth crusade is in light blue. Can't really see it because it's here in the Mediterranean, making it hard to see. Crusade of Frederic II is in purple, and Crusade of Louis coming out of France there. The Crusader kingdoms that were established, the Crusader states. There you go. Kind of giving you an idea of where this is taking place. The Crusades offered European kings the chance to expand their bureaucracies. European markets were introduced to Eastern goods, and the Italian merchants were making a strong profit trading those items. The Crusades were disastrous for the Jewish communities in Eastern Europe who came under attack by angry Christian crusaders. A deep bitterness developed between the Christians and Muslims. Later, Christopher Columbus hoped to establish a base in India where he could relaunch the Crusades against Islam. But let's talk a little bit about the life of the people. So, life and work of peasants. Peasants made up the largest portion of the European population. When nobles fought their wars, it was usually the peasants who lost their homes, barns, and their lives. Changes in climate affected agricultural production and had great impacts on ordinary peasants. During the medieval warm period, between about 950 and 1250, the growing season was longer and certain crops could be planted further north, helping northern settlements like the Vikings to flourish. Serfdom, remember, was hereditary, so a person who was born a serf could have achieved freedom, but many remained in that caste their entire lives. Peasant villages were located on the estates of lords. Villages consisted of peasant houses, a church, and in some cases the large house where the lord lived. The peasant diet consisted of mainly bread with vegetables because animals were too valuable to be eaten. So they were kind of eating a vegetarian life back then. Only a few families achieved noble status until the knights began to claim privileges offered to the nobility. Nobles paid few taxes and controlled the peasants living on the land and in the villages. Nobles had to maintain their military obligation to the king and to attend to the royal court. A code of conduct, known as chivalry, was established to ensure the behavior of knights. A woman within the nobility was the manager of the household and could inherit the state from her husband. Population growth, increases in agricultural production, and political stability allowed the peasant village to grow into a town. Towns were established trading centers that were enclosed by security walls. As population increased, the walls were expanded. Serfdom gradually dissolved, as serfs and peasants were now able to find more work in these towns. Merchants became the most influential and powerful group in the town. They organized into guilds and prohibited non-members, those who were not part of the guild, from trading. Merchants pulled together to minimize risk and monopolize the political offices. Tradesmen also created guilds, and that included people like your butchers, weavers, blacksmiths, bakers, and a wide variety of other skilled professionals. These organizations were known as craft guilds. Okay, that's kind of cool, right? But what about like expansion of these guilds and trade in the commercial revolution that happened? So Venice became one of the largest cities to lead in general trade throughout Asia and North Africa. In Northern Europe, we have the Hanseatic League, and it was formed as a mercantile association of towns hoping to achieve security and exclusive trade rights. Cities from Holland all the way to Poland became members of the League. Capitalism developed new wealth that caught the attention of the kings and rulers because, guess what? Wealth could be taxed. Historians call the increase of wealth the commercial revolution. With the taxes, kings could establish a centralized and stronger state. So just to give you an idea, here's the League for you. And some of you who may not be familiar with where all these places that we're talking about are. Here's Poland, all the way to, what do they call it? Holland, which is now the Netherlands. So, all basically across most of Northern Europe is where this league is formed. Let's talk about getting some education on universities and scholasticism. So earlier, only religious institutions such as like monasteries and cathedral schools offered any type of formal education. Businessmen established municipal schools, which, along with cathedral schools, developed into these larger universities. Interest in the study of Roman law and the Justinian Code increased at the university level. The field of medicine improved as students were provided with training. The physicians' high status and education allowed them to increase their fees. Medieval professors focused on thinking, reasoning, and writing, and they became known as scholastics or schoolmen. These individuals spent their time collecting and organizing knowledge on all sorts of topics. The method of teaching was primarily lecture, which we all know is boring, right? And the method of examinations was primarily oral examinations, and that's incredibly hard. We still do oral examinations, especially if you get into the graduate level. Not only do you have to sit for your comprehensive exams, which are like writing, but you also have to sit for oral comprehensive exams. And those are hard. The popularity of Romanesque architecture declined as a new style begins to emerge, and this new style was called Gothic, because citizens believed only uncouth Goths could develop such unusual architectural taste. Gothic architecture included pointed arches, high ceilings, and exterior wall supports known as flying buttresses, and the buttresses carried much of the weight of the roof. Stained glass windows cut into stone created sacred scenes shown through uninterpreted light. And churches remained important for the local community, but the construction of huge cathedrals became testimonies of community faith. And one good example of that is the Notre Dame in Paris, France. If you'll remember, this one burned recently and they're trying to restore it back, but you can see like this is a Gothic style cathedral. And this picture does not do it justice, but see all these little feet? These are people. So you can tell how massive this thing is. So vernacular literature and drama. So when we talk about something in the vernacular, we're talking about in the language that everyday people speak. Latin, that was a scholarly language used in university education. Can you imagine trying to sit through this class in Latin? Like, don't worry, I can't pronounce most Latin words, but that's insane, right? In the High Middle Ages, though, luckily, we see some authors began to write in the everyday language of their region, which linguistics, that's what they refer to as the vernacular. Poets who wrote and sang lyrical verse of love, desire, beauty, and other human values called themselves troubadours. Any of you familiar with country music, you've probably heard of the turnpike troubadours. In the 14th century, evidence indicates an increased literacy among lay people. But something happens. We have a crisis of the later Middle Ages. We have a lot of things that happen, and it's really sad. Like one thing after another seems to happen. We have the Little Ice Age and the Black Death. That's what's going to start. So a cooling of global temperatures had a dramatic effect on Europe. Agricultural production suffered. Poor harvests forced increase in food prices. This also created a scarcity in food, which led to starvation. Undernourished people were easily susceptible to illness. A new disease plagued Europe. It became known as the Black Death. The plague killed close to 1/3 of the European population. The illness was characterized by boils, known as bubo, which gave the illness its name, bubonic plague. It was also called the Black Death because black spots or blotches were caused by bleeding under the skin. Right? So you know how like you get a really bad bruise because your blood pulls up under the skin? That's what would happen if you got the bubonic plague as well. Many believe the plague was caused by poison in the air, leading them to breathe strong-smelling herbs. They also believe bloodletting removed the poisons. Others blame the Jews for poisoning their wells, which led to the murder of thousands of people within the Jewish community. Here's the appearance of the plague. And you can tell like it's coming. We know that it came more than likely on fleas on rats on ships coming out of Asia, right? And you can see along the major trade routes too, right? Land and sea where it's coming in. So 1346 it starts. 1347 it's starting to spread even more, right? All these areas. Then 1348 goes from the coastal areas. It's starting to now go inland. And look up here in Europe. 1349, I mean also across, the Arabian Peninsula. But spreads very quickly and lasts for, this was in 4 years, see how quickly it spread. Now because of the constant contact that we have with each other and faster trade routes, that's why COVID spread so quickly and in a shorter amount of time. But as you can tell, even back then, 4 years doesn't seem like a long time, especially since we're living in COVID right now. But 4 years, that's a pretty quick spread of a plague. Then we have, after the bubonic plague, now we're going to go into the 100 Years' War. And this is where England and France both claimed the same territory of a part of France. The war fought in France included the use of longbows and a new technology, the early cannon. The French victory came as the result of the actions of a young girl known as Joan of Arc, who defeated the English at Orleans. The English allies captured Joan and sold her to the English, who then tried her for heresy and burned her at the stake. For both France and England, the war promoted this nationalistic unity. It brought all of England together and it brought all of France together in this mutual hatred for one another. The church was weakened over the debate about who was the legitimate pope. So if you go back and you remember from chapter 8, I put that video up in last week's module. Go back and look at the Great Schism. It really does a great explanation of what was happening and how the church is beginning to be weakened over the debate of the Pope. So the French monarchy had the Pope move to Avignon, where the next 7 popes lived. All of them happened to be French. One of the French popes moved back to Rome, where he died, and the Roman citizens demanded an Italian pope who would stay in the Vatican, not in France. So under Italian pressure, Urban VI was elected. But he was very arrogant and an unpopular guy, causing a claim that the election was invalid because of Roman pressures. A French pope was then elected, and he placed his authority back in Avignon, France. And this created 2 popes. You've got one in France and one in Rome. And this is what's called or known as the Great Schism. A council was called that deposed the popes and a new leader was elected. So here we go. You can see the allegiance to Rome here in the dark orange, seeing that this is the legit pope, the one that lives in Rome, and the allegiance to the one in Avignon in France here is in, saying that we swear our allegiance to the one in France. In this area, it would just depend on their mood, who they wanted to go with. And lastly, English peasant revolts. They're going to develop not over really what's going on in Rome and in France, but over increased taxes and other grievances. The labor supply had been reduced due to the Black Death, the plague, causing peasants to demand higher pay. Castles and manors were sacked and some nobles were murdered. And the uprisings, they will be violently crushed, meaning if you participate in an uprising, you're probably going to die because military is going to come in and kill off everyone. So disease and famine and war, that really marked the 14th century. And we kind of end on a downer, right? But in the next chapter, we're going to talk about like the rebirth of Europe and how they come out of all of these violent uprisings and disease and famine, and how we have this cultural rebirth, this cultural renaissance that happens in the next couple of centuries. So stay tuned for that one. That's what chapter 15 is going to cover.